The room was full of people I loved. Candles flickered on every table. Wine flowed freely. My name is Adrian Cole. I am a 44-year-old man who built his company from a single rented desk and a borrowed laptop. That evening, I sat at the head of the dinner table in our home, a home I designed, funded, and filled, and watched my wife stand up, tap her glass, and announce to both our families that she was 8 weeks pregnant. The applause was immediate. My father gripped my shoulder. Her mother burst into tears. Everyone looked at me, waiting for the proud husband to rise. I stood. I smiled. I raised my glass. I said all the right words. But somewhere behind the warmth in my chest, something cold and quiet had already begun to move. It was not jealousy. It was not anger. It was something sharper and more patient than both. I noticed the way Vivian's eyes swept the room before she made her announcement. Not with joy, but with calculation. Like someone checking every exit before walking through the door. I tucked that feeling away carefully. I smiled again. I let the evening carry on around me, and I began, in the quietest corner of my mind, to pay very close attention. I have always been a careful man. People mistake my calm for coldness, but that is not what it is. I simply learned early in life that the loudest reaction is rarely the most powerful one. So when I noticed the way Vivian's hands moved during the celebration, slightly too deliberate, slightly too composed, I said nothing. I watched instead. She laughed at the right moments. She leaned into her mother's arms at the right moments. She looked at me with exactly the right amount of tender love. Every beat was perfectly placed, and that was the problem. Real joy is messy. Real joy forgets to check who is watching. Hers never did. During dessert, her phone lit up on the table beside her plate. She saw the screen first and flipped it face down in one smooth motion. The name I caught in that half second was not one I recognized, not a coworker or friend she had ever mentioned. I held it in a quiet corner of my mind and said nothing. I laughed at something my uncle said and let the evening continue. I had learned long ago that patience is not simply about waiting. It is about watching carefully, watching completely, and storing what you see in a place where no one else can reach. I want to be honest about what Vivian meant to me before all of this. She was not just a wife. She was someone I chose to build a life around. When we met 7 years ago, she had a small clothing boutique that was struggling badly. She had passion and genuine taste, but no head for the numbers behind it. I helped her restructure the business model. I introduced her to better suppliers. I funded the relaunch quietly, without making a point of pride between us. The boutique failed anyway, 18 months later. She was devastated. I funded the second attempt without being asked. I believed in her vision more than she did herself at that point. The second version broke even most months, and I covered the income gap without complaint for 3 years. I was not doing these things to hold power over her. I was doing them because I loved her and believed that love meant carrying more weight on the days the other person could not. What I did not understand then was that there is a real difference between someone who leans on your strength and someone who quietly studies it, searching for the softest and most profitable place to press down hard. There is one memory that has stayed with me longer than most. It happened about 14 months before that dinner. Vivian told me she was attending a 3-day boutique owners conference in Atlanta. She had been to similar events before, and I had no reason to question it. But 2 days into her trip, a supplier I had introduced her to, a woman named Doris, called my personal number by mistake, thinking she was reaching Vivian. Doris mentioned she was looking forward to seeing Vivian at a trade event in Chicago the following week. Not Atlanta, Chicago. When Vivian came home, I said nothing. I watched her describe the Atlanta conference in detail over dinner. The panels, the speakers, the hotel. She had done her research well. It was a convincing performance. That same week, I scheduled a quiet lunch with my longtime attorney, a man named Bernard Okafor. I told him I needed to revisit a clause we had drafted into my estate trust 3 years earlier, back when I first felt a subtle unease I could not yet fully name. Bernard listened. He confirmed the clause remained active and its trigger conditions were intact. I drove home that afternoon, feeling a calm I could not quite explain to myself yet. The clause was something Bernard and I had built carefully and quietly when I first began to feel that something in my marriage did not sit level. It was buried inside the formal language of my estate trust, several pages deep, in a section most people, even most lawyers, would skim right past. Vivian had signed the trust documents as required during our marriage, but she had done so the way people sign long agreements they believe will never truly matter, quickly, with a small joke about how unromantic paperwork was. I had smiled and agreed with her. What the clause stated, in plain terms, was this: any child born within the marriage would be entitled to estate inheritance provisions only upon verified biological confirmation. It was not phrased to suggest suspicion. It read as standard estate protection language, the kind wealthy families use to guard against fraud in all its forms. Bernard had crafted the exact wording. It did not read like distrust. It read like diligence. Vivian never asked about it again after signing. I never raised it. I let it sit there, patient and invisible, inside every document that described our shared life. The most effective protection is the kind no one sees coming until it is already fully in place. In the weeks after the pregnancy announcement, Vivian transformed. It was subtle at first, then it built steadily, like water rising in a sealed room. She began attending charity events she had previously shown no interest in. She started calling our home, the estate, in conversation with friends, a word she had never used before. She posted the announcement online with a photo of us in the garden, captioned with words about legacy and new beginnings. She printed the post and had it framed. She moved through social gatherings with a new kind of confidence, the confidence of a woman who believed she had just made her position permanent. Within 3 weeks of the announcement, she brought up the financial conversation I had been quietly expecting. Over breakfast, she said she wanted to review our asset arrangements to make sure everything was protected for the baby. She used those words carefully. She rested her hand on her still flat stomach as she spoke. I said that sounded reasonable. I told her we should bring Bernard into the conversation. I watched something small and satisfied move through her eyes before she smiled at me and agreed that yes, Bernard would be a good idea. Vivian moved quickly once she believed the door was open. Within a week of that breakfast, she had already spoken to her own solicitor, a man named Patrick whom I had never met, and together they drafted a proposal. She presented it to me one evening as I came in from work, printed neatly and placed on the kitchen counter like a considered gift. The proposal suggested creating a separate trust in her name, funded with a portion of my company holdings, as a financial security structure for the baby. The language was warm and maternal on the surface, but I'd spent 20 years reading financial documents. Beneath the warmth was a request for control over assets worth approximately $4 million, with her named as sole trustee and no reversal clause if the marriage ended. I read it twice. I set it down. I told her it was a thoughtful idea and I would have Bernard review it properly. She nodded and said she thought Bernard would find it entirely fair. I called Bernard that night. He said he would schedule a meeting. I told him to pull the clause file beforehand. He told me it was already sitting on his desk, ready and waiting. Bernard Okafor had been my attorney for 11 years. He was a tall, quiet man in his late 50s who listened completely and said only what was necessary. He had helped me structure every major financial decision I had made since age 33. He knew my business and my patterns of thinking better than almost anyone. When Vivian and I sat in his office to discuss her proposal, he was professional, warm, and entirely unreadable. He walked her through the standard questions, her financial goals, her expectations for the child's future, how she envisioned the trust working over time. She answered confidently. She had clearly prepared with Patrick. But Bernard was not really asking about the trust. He was assessing her, gathering information through ordinary-sounding conversation. At one point, Vivian said she saw this arrangement as bringing lasting stability to the family. Bernard wrote something on his notepad. After she left the room briefly, he looked at me and said nothing. He simply tapped the folder on his desk, the clause file, once. A single quiet nod. The trust she was proposing would activate conditions working directly against her own plan. She did not know it yet. Prenatal appointments began in the 7th week of Vivian's pregnancy. I attended the first one, as any devoted husband would. The obstetrician, a kind woman named Dr. Farida Osei, explained clearly what to expect in the coming months. She reviewed Vivian's dates and confirmed the gestational timeline from the ultrasound measurements. I asked one question quietly, as though it were purely casual. I asked Dr. Osei to confirm the estimated conception date from the scan. She looked at the measurements and gave a range, most likely conceived between 12 and 14 weeks prior to that appointment. I did the calculation in my head while she was still speaking. That window placed conception squarely during the period when Vivian had told me she was attending the conference in Atlanta. The same Atlanta conference Doris had unknowingly contradicted with her Chicago mention 14 months earlier. I held that number quietly in my chest for the entire drive home. Vivian talked about baby names most of the journey. I told her I liked the one she suggested. When we arrived home, she went inside ahead of me. I sat alone in the car for a long moment. I was not panicking. I was not grieving. I was calculating. And there is a very important difference between those three things. She came to me 2 nights later with a carefully chosen approach. She sat beside me on the sofa and said she was worried I seemed distant. She said pregnancy should bring couples closer, and she felt I was somewhere else in my head. She used soft, patient language throughout. She said she wondered if the financial conversations were adding stress, and she did not want money casting a shadow over what should be a beautiful season. Then she said something I have not forgotten. I know you sometimes overthink things, Adrian. It's one of the things I love about you, but sometimes you just have to trust. She rested her head on my shoulder. I put my arm around her. I said she was right. I apologized for seeming distant. She accepted the apology with a quiet exhale, and I felt her relax completely against me. She believed she had just redirected things. She believed the apology was a white flag. What she did not know was that I had already begun independent paternity verification through a private medical specialist Bernard had quietly referred me to. The paperwork was signed. The appointment was set. I simply held her close and said nothing more. The next piece came not from a lab, but from a name. Bernard's investigative contact, a professional who worked with corporate legal teams on fraud matters, had been quietly researching the name I had glimpsed on Vivian's phone the night of the dinner. His name was Roland Vance. He was an architect, 40 years old, based in the same city as the Chicago trade event Doris had mentioned. His firm's website listed completed projects. One of those projects was a boutique renovation in our city, finished 2 years earlier. Vivian's boutique. He had designed the interior of a second relaunch. I had funded that relaunch without knowing his name. The contact found a pattern of sustained communication between Roland and a phone number registered to Vivian. Not her main phone, but a secondary one I had never known existed. The messages spanned the same 14 months I had been tracking. Bernard handed me the summary report at a private meeting. I read it. I folded it carefully back into the envelope. I asked Bernard what came next. He said the paternity results would arrive within 10 days. I told him I would not confront Vivian until every single piece was in position. He said that was correct. Vivian chose that same week to begin planning the baby shower. The scale of it surprised even me. She booked a private room at one of the most prestigious venues in the city, commissioned a florist, and hired a professional event planner. Invitations went out not only to family and close friends, but also to several of my key business partners and their spouses. In her mind, I believe the event was more strategic than celebratory. Having my associates present meant their perception of Vivian as the established, expecting wife of Adrian Cole would be publicly locked in. It was a calculated move, and I could recognize the thinking even as I identified what it truly was. I did not object to any of the plans. I told her the venue choice was excellent. Meanwhile, Bernard and I were finalizing the legal documents to formally activate the clause in my estate trust upon the child's birth. The timing had to be precise. The clause required activation before any new financial arrangements were signed in the child's name. Her trust proposal had not yet been formally agreed upon. We were still inside the window, and I intended to use every remaining day of it carefully. The shower invitations went out on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Vivian had shared the event across her social media accounts. Friends responded with hearts and warm congratulations. Two of my business contacts' wives messaged her privately to say they were looking forward to attending. Vivian's posture changed noticeably in those days. She moved through the house more slowly and deliberately, like someone who believed she had finally arrived somewhere she had been quietly working toward for years. At a charity event that week, she was introduced to new guests as the wife and mother of Adrian Cole's heir. I was told afterward that she did not correct the phrasing at all. She began referring to my company as our legacy in conversation with my own mother during a Sunday phone call. I caught my mother's slight pause before she responded. In the evenings at home, Vivian became less urgent about the financial conversations, as though she had decided the momentum was already carrying her exactly where she needed to go. She was right that momentum was building in that period. She was simply wrong about whose momentum it actually was. Bernard called me Thursday evening. The paternity documents will be ready for my signature by Monday. The baby shower was Saturday. The timing, as Bernard said quietly, was precise. The results arrived in a sealed envelope at Bernard's office on Friday afternoon. He called me. His voice was measured and steady, which I appreciated more than he probably knew. He said he had reviewed the findings from the independent specialist and read me the conclusion without dramatic pause. The child Vivian was carrying was not biologically mine. I sat in my office chair for a long moment after the call. The city moved outside my window, indifferent and continuous. I thought about the years spent building everything around a shared future. I thought about the second boutique, the Atlanta story, Roland Vance's firm. I thought about the clause sitting quietly inside a document she had signed without reading. I did not feel what people expect a man to feel in that moment. There was no rage, no urge to call her and lay out what I knew. What I felt was a cold and complete clarity, the kind that arrives when you've been sensing something for a long time and the evidence finally catches up to the instinct. I called Bernard back. I told him the clause activation documents needed to be ready for Saturday. He said they already were. I told him I would see him at the baby shower. He said he would be there. Saturday arrived. The venue was genuinely beautiful. I will say that honestly. White and sage green flowers filled every corner. Tables held candles and small framed photographs of us, of places we had traveled, one from our wedding day. Guests arrived in warm waves. Vivian moved through the room like a woman who had finally reached somewhere she had been quietly working toward. She greeted everyone with ease and looked beautiful in a cream dress. I stayed beside her for the first hour, laughing at the right moments, accepting congratulations with a steady hand. No one could have known what I was carrying in my jacket pocket. After the opening toast from family, Vivian gave her own warm address, perfectly controlled words about gratitude and legacy in the future. I sat composed and waited. Then I gave a brief toast of my own, about truth, about integrity, and about the kind of strength that outlasts every storm. A few guests exchanged quiet glances. Seconds later, the door at the back of the room opened, and Bernard Okafor walked in, carrying a leather document folder. He moved calmly toward the front of the room, and Vivian's smile stayed on her face, but her eyes changed immediately. Bernard introduced himself simply as my legal representative and said there was a matter of estate administration requiring formal acknowledgement before witnesses, as the trust document required. He explained this in plain, unhurried language, the kind that made it impossible to object without appearing to misunderstand the process entirely. Vivian's shoulders stiffened by a fraction. Bernard opened the folder and explained the clause within the estate trust, the one linking all inheritance arrangements for any child born within the marriage to verified biological confirmation. He noted this condition had been a binding part of the signed trust for over 3 years. He noted it had now been formally triggered and that the triggering event was irrevocable. He was precise and without cruelty, a seasoned professional doing his fully documented job. The room went very still. Not the comfortable stillness of a conversation that has momentarily paused. The sharp, held stillness of a room where people have suddenly understood that something real and irreversible is happening, and none of them know how to place themselves within it. Vivian's hand, which had been resting openly on the table, moved quietly to her lap. She said nothing. She simply waited. And so did I, composed, hands folded, watching the room register what Bernard had set in motion. Bernard opened the second section of the folder. He stated clearly that in the course of standard estate verification, an independent specialist had conducted paternity confirmation. He did not linger on the phrasing. He stated the conclusion plainly. Biological parentage of the child did not match the estate's primary benefactor. He placed the document face up on the nearest table so it was visible to those seated closest. Then he mentioned Roland Vance by name, not as a dramatic accusation, but as a factual element of the formal legal record. A man whose sustained communications with Vivian over 14 months were documented through a secondary phone number registered to her. One I had not known existed. The overlap between those communications and the medically estimated conception window was noted with precision and clarity. The room absorbed all of this in complete silence. Vivian's mother made a startled, involuntary sound. Someone at the far table exhaled audibly. I did not look directly at Vivian. I could feel her eyes crossing the room toward mine, searching for any signal that a way through this moment still existed. There was none. The legal record existed. The witnesses existed. The clause existed. She had signed those documents with her own hand in Bernard's office on a quiet Wednesday afternoon 3 years prior. Bernard then walked through the timeline with careful, measured precision. He drew attention to the medical documentation from Dr. Osei's clinic, specifically the conception window of 12 to 14 weeks before the first prenatal appointment. That window corresponded directly to the period when Vivian had told me she was attending a professional conference in Atlanta. Bernard noted there was no registration record for Vivian at that Atlanta event, not in the attendee list, not in the hotel records. He noted there was a hotel record in Chicago during that same week, connected to Roland Vance's firm. He noted that Vivian's secondary phone showed sustained, regular communication with Roland throughout that period. Each piece was presented as a connected sequence, not scattered accusations, but a structure. A structure assembled from dates, documents, and verifiable records that did not shift under emotional pressure. Vivian tried to speak. She said Bernard's name in a voice noticeably thinner than she intended. He paused, looked at her directly, and told her she was welcome to consult her own legal counsel before responding to any findings. He said this without cruelty. Then he added one final detail. Effective immediately, all joint financial accounts had been frozen pending resolution of the estate clause. Her expression went completely still. The prenuptial agreement we had signed before our wedding returned to the room like a cold draft under a door. It contained a clause, separate from the estate trust, that addressed material misrepresentation. It stated clearly that if either party made significant misrepresentations causing the other to make financial decisions they would not otherwise have made, all contested assets would revert to the deceived party. Bernard had a copy with him. He explained it without drama. Vivian had accepted substantial financial support for her business ventures. The boutique relaunches, operating expenses, the event planning costs, while maintaining a concealed relationship throughout. She had then used the pregnancy to accelerate access to further assets through the proposed $4 million trust. Those facts constituted material misrepresentation under the terms she had personally signed. The prenup enforcement clause activated alongside the estate clause. The overlap was not accidental. Bernard and I had built these two documents to work together years apart for exactly this kind of moment. Vivian stood up from her chair. Her voice came out sharp. She said I had planned this against her, that it was all a trap. I finally looked at her directly. I said quietly that I had trusted her completely, and that was precisely why I had been so careful. Bernard allowed the room to settle before speaking one final time. He addressed the guests briefly and professionally. He noted that the clause in the estate trust had been written 3 years earlier, not in response to the pregnancy announcement, but in response to an earlier concern that was never fully resolved. He referenced the amendment date on the document. It predated the pregnancy by more than 2 years. That single detail landed exactly the way I knew it would. The room understood immediately that this was not a reaction. It had been preparation, long, patient, deliberate preparation, built quietly while Vivian was still deciding on her first move. Every financial safeguard, every quiet meeting with Bernard, every document signed without ceremony, all of it had been architecture. And Roland Vance had removed himself from the situation entirely the week prior, when Bernard's team made contact. He issued no public statement. He simply disappeared, exactly when Vivian needed him most. She stood in the middle of the room she had designed, the event she had orchestrated, and there was no one left beside her. Not her affair partner, not her solicitor, not a single ally in the space she had chosen to make her stage. The guests did not leave in anger. They left quietly, in small groups, the way people exit a room where something irreversible has happened. There were no dramatic speeches from the crowd. There was only the steady, unhurried emptying of a space that had been gathered for celebration and found something else entirely. Vivian's mother left quickly with her sister, both avoiding my eyes. My own mother stayed, seated long after others had filtered out. She looked at me across the nearly empty room with an expression I could not fully name, part sorrow, part something like tired pride. I nodded at her. She nodded back and left without a word, which was exactly right. My business associates filed out with the measured composure of people who deal in information and know when to stay silent about it. Within 40 minutes, the room held only Vivian, Bernard, 2 of his staff, and me. A florist's assistant moved quietly between the tables, beginning to break down the arrangements. The candles still burned. White and sage-green flowers sat undisturbed in their vases. The event designed to cement her future had instead dissolved it in front of every person she had most wanted to impress. She asked for a private conversation, and I agreed. We sat in a small room off the main hall. She had composed herself and was not crying. I think she understood tears would not move me at this stage, and she was too intelligent to waste them. She asked what I wanted. I told her honestly, nothing from her. I wanted only the clarity and honesty I had not had in a long time. She asked if there was any way forward for us. I said no, not from anger, but because trust built on the wrong foundation does not get repaired. It gets rebuilt somewhere else, with different materials, by someone who chooses more carefully the next time. She said she had made mistakes. She said fear had played a part. I did not argue with that. I told her Bernard's office would be in touch with the separation terms. Terms that would be fair to what she was legitimately owed and nothing beyond that. She asked quietly if I hated her. I considered it honestly before answering. I told her I did not. I told her I had genuinely loved her. And that, I said, was precisely why I had been so thorough about protecting everything I'd spent my life building. The legal separation moved with the efficiency that arrives when documents have already done the essential work. Because the prenuptial fraud clause had been activated, the joint asset pool was significantly reduced. Vivian retained what she had brought into the marriage and what she had legitimately earned during it. The boutique, which had operated primarily on my capital across 2 separate relaunches, reverted to my holding company as a business asset. The $4 million trust proposal she and Patrick had drafted was never signed and therefore carried no legal weight whatsoever. Roland Vance had no standing in the proceedings and did not seek any. He had already moved forward before the separation was even formally filed. Our home, the one I had designed and built, remained mine. Vivian relocated to an apartment on the east side of the city. The process was orderly and without public spectacle, because there were no longer grounds to contest the core findings. You cannot argue with a clause you signed in an attorney's office on a quiet Wednesday afternoon 3 years ago. You cannot claim deception when the document is in plain language and your signature sits at the bottom of the page. Everything I had built remained completely intact. 3 months after the separation was finalized, I sat in Bernard's office for a very different kind of meeting. I had spent several weeks reviewing proposals from 3 charitable foundations focused on helping young people from under-resourced communities pursue careers in business and finance. I had built everything I owned from very little: a rented desk, a borrowed laptop, the willingness to sit with discomfort longer than most people could tolerate, and to keep working regardless. I decided to redirect a significant portion of the estate's philanthropic provisions into a dedicated scholarship fund. I named it after no person, not myself, not my family. I named it after a principle. I called it the Patience Foundation because everything I had protected and everything I had rebuilt had come from the same source. The willingness to wait, to watch carefully, and to act only when the time was fully right. Bernard drafted the documents. I signed them without ceremony. While I walked out of his office that afternoon, the city felt genuinely lighter than it had in a long time, as though I had been carrying something heavy for years and had finally set it down in exactly the right place, where it could do something real and lasting. People ask me sometimes what the lesson is. They want something portable, a principle to write down and keep. I understand that impulse. We want our pain to produce something useful. What I can tell you is this. I did not win because I was smarter than Vivian. She was genuinely intelligent. I did not win because I was angrier or more calculating. I was not angry at all. I prevailed because I understood, earlier than she expected, that preparation is the quietest and most powerful form of strength a person can carry. The most effective armor is the kind no one knows you are wearing. The most effective protection is the kind already in place before the threat arrives. The most dangerous response to someone planning against you is to let them walk forward, confident and unchallenged, into a structure you built years before their first move. I rebuilt my life in the months that followed. I worked. I gave. I moved forward with the same patience and clarity that had protected everything I built. Vivian believed a pregnancy would make her position permanent, that a child would be the lock on the door. What she never bothered to read was that the door was already mine. The most powerful protection is never suspicion. It is preparation.